Prime Minister Mark Carney says he will speak with U.S. President Donald Trump in the coming days. This comes a day after Trump announced a 25% tariff on all vehicles made outside of the United States. The president says these tariffs are permanent and will come into effect April 2nd. We'll get to the power panel in just a moment for how all of this is shaking up the election campaign. But first, we're going to talk to Lana Payne. She is, of course, the national president of Unifor, and she joins me now. Lana Payne, it's good to see you again. Thanks for being here on a busy day.
Thanks for having me, David.
You met with Mark Carney yesterday. You were with him as the details were coming out from President Trump about the auto tariffs. What's your reaction to where things are and what Canada should do in response?
Oh, Lord, a lot has happened in 24 hours. This was not unexpected, David. We knew that the auto industry in particular and Canadian auto workers were in the crosshairs of this president, and that he was going to put tariffs on the industry and on Canadian work. And that's what we've seen. The risk is if we don't respond and find a way to get those tariffs removed, we will lose jobs in this country, no doubt about it. And just as importantly, we will lose investment over the short and long term. So we may be able to find a short-term solution, but what we need to be looking at is also down the road, and not just having an expedient solution that could cause us bigger challenges in a year or two from now.
So we don't know what the response is going to be from the government. They say it's going to come next week when they have a little bit more clarity from the president, not just on auto, but on all of these reciprocal tariffs. But you're calling for a defend the auto plan, right? So how do you do that without provoking an escalation from Donald Trump, which he is threatening, that is economically crippling across all sectors?
Yeah, the reality is that the sector is in danger already from what he has announced because of the integration of the auto sector across, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. All you need is one break in the supply chain, and this whole thing comes crashing in. That's the reality, and perhaps, honestly, David, that's what's needed to show exactly, what's at risk here in Canada, but also how American workers will be impacted by this too. But what we have said is that we have to make sure that Canadian auto workers do not get squeezed here in the middle of whatever concessions are being considered in the United States, in the discussions that are happening between Donald Trump and the automakers that operate in Canada. And we do not want our members, we do not want Canadian auto workers to be pawns in whatever it is that gets resolved there. So we have to do what we can in Canada, and there's a lot we can do to protect the industry and protect the workers of Canada.
But Donald Trump seems intent on breaking that supply chain and forcing it to repair itself inside the borders of the United States. I mean, how real is that threat at this particular moment?
It is real, David, and I think that the challenge is that what promises get made to appease Trump, and that's the danger we have to look at, and we have to play hardball with corporations, whether in the auto sector or anywhere, who are looking to sacrifice Canadian workers in order to appease this Trump, this president. The reality is we can't do that. And if that means we have to say to corporations who shift production that if you want access to the Canadian market, you have to, and you want to sell here, you're going to have to build here. That's the reality of it. And if you think you're going to have access to a free market, that's not the way it's going to work. We've got to do everything. We've got to put it all on the table because everything is at risk right now. It's the most critical time in my adult life in terms of what we are dealing with as working people in this country and what Canadians are dealing with at large.
Who is it, though, you think, Lana Payne, that is trying to appease Donald Trump here? I know people want to try to find some compromises in a way that gives a win without really undermining the economic security and integrity of the country, but that's kind of standard politics and negotiation. I mean, who and what type of appeasement are you most worried about right now?
Well, imagine if we get to a point where the automakers or any company says, well, we can live with a certain tariff. But how long are they going to live with it, David? How long are they going to live with a tariff on Canadian goods when the reality is that just gives them time then to to shift production. And you're not going to put up with it. You will over time figure out a way where you don't have to pay this. And that is the biggest danger. And I think you'll recall the first conversation we had about this in January. I was warning about this, that this is an attack on Canadian jobs and on investment. And both of these go hand in hand. If we don't have investment, we don't have jobs. And this is the big challenge we're facing right now.
Mark Carney said today that the auto pact is dead. He's talked about the free trade deal essentially being torn up. I mean, do you think that's where things truly are right now? Because he has proposed the idea, Mr. Carney has, of moving as much of the parts manufacturing as you can inside Canada to protect it from tariffs. But even the mayor of Windsor said that's not a viable idea, right? Because you need that integrated market and the supply chains that have been built. So do you think the auto relationship as we know it is over, as Mark Carney said today?
I think it's bigger than auto. I think this whole relationship with the United States is completely changed right now, which is why we have to do what we can in this moment we're in the trade war that we are in, because we are already in it. And then we have to look at what we do as a country to build a more resilient Canadian economy. And there are many things we can do. We are rich in resources. We have a lot of leverage. We can build things in Canada. We can put our procurement dollars to work, making Canadians work. And we're going to have to do all of it, including diversifying trade. These are not new things that any of us are saying. But the reality is that we can't not do it now. This is a moment for Canada where there's no going back.
Lana Payne, always appreciate the time. Lana Payne is the national president of Unifor. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, David.
All right, the Power Panel has been listening in on this very busy day. They join me now. Cameron Amado is the head of communications for former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. And Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Not a lot of slow days in this election so far. James, what are your thoughts on where things are right now with the latest from Donald Trump yesterday and Mark Carney's response as Liberal leader and as Prime Minister today?
You will recall, I think it was 1 week ago right now, where we had this conversation and it looked like everything was going well. We had Secretary Lutnick and we had the scrum of Premier Ford on the street, and here we are a week later and everything has gone the other direction. So, things change quickly and all that. Prime Minister Carney, I think, had a very good moment and was very clear and firm. And I think the tone and the messaging that's coming out of both him and Pierre Poilievre is very important for Canadians. We are headed towards dark and tough times, and we need people who are serious and tough and responsible, speaking truth to Canadians about what the storm is that is in front of us. And I hope that translates not just through tone, but also into the substance of the election campaign and what people are going to be putting on the table as a reasonable counterbalance to the American threat to the Canadian economy. Both parties have now pledged to lower, for example, the bottom marginal tax rate in the country to provide all Canadians tax relief. That's good. We also need to have a conversation about business taxes and investment taxes and the top marginal tax rates in this country. It's one thing to encourage companies not to leave the country and to take the bait of the threat of Donald Trump's tariffs, but we also need to encourage them because we need to set in place and in motion fiscal structure in this country and a tax structure and an investment climate in this country that encourages people to stay in this country, do business in this country as a result of policies, not just as a result of sentiment. And I don't see that having been broached in the election campaign yet, but I hope it comes.
Well, Cameron, maybe we'll get a policy response when we get more clarity on what the actual tariffs are going to be and how they're going to be implemented and what they're going to look like. As you four well know, there's what Donald Trump says and then there's what Donald Trump does, and not always the same. So, Cameron, what are your thoughts on where this has put the campaign at this point in time and what people should do to respond to it?
I think James said it very well. I mean, this just underlines that the number one question that will drive this entire campaign, and I think that increasingly Canadians are going to base their decision on, is who is best positioned and who can best respond to the threats from the United States. And the best response that we can demonstrate as a country, election or not, is a unified front and solidarity and unity from every order of government and from every political party. And I think that's in large part why Mark Carney has been doing so well so far, and people have been responding well to him, is because he has seemed to meet the moment in this crisis. I mean, just looking at his response today, it was very solid, very sober, and very realistic. He managed to sort of weave the realism that we need to communicate to Canadians about what is coming and the pain that the economy and everyone is going to feel, but some of the steps that he's going to take and that everyone can take together. I think you're seeing that from the premiers, you're seeing that across the board, but it will continue to define every single day of this election, and everybody has to just brace themselves for these tariffs to obviously cause pain to the economy, but for changes to come from the White House and for further announcements that we have no idea what they might be.
So Andrew, how do you even begin to respond to this with policy in sort of the chaos and the churn of it all, and then sort of just the kinetic pace of an election campaign? Like I think James has got a point there that this is going to force a very big reconsideration of how we do business in Canada at a lot of levels. How do you do that and run a campaign at the same time?
Yeah, it was Kim Campbell who said elections aren't a time to talk about policy.
I don't think anyone's going to say that this election.
No, it certainly doesn't seem that way, and certainly not Mark Carney. I watched his press conference today, and if anything, it was almost a point towards the end where it's getting lost in the detail of what he's actually trying to say. I mean, obviously the cabinet is thinking about this. What Trump's doing is clearly playing into, I think what the Liberals have set up as the ballot question, what Canadians are receptive to as a ballot question, which is how do you respond to Donald Trump? The question that's still sitting out there, though, is are Canadians resolved on what the solution is? And, do the parties still have an opportunity to talk about that, or is it really still an emotional, top-line kind of response that's being sought? I still think Poilievre and obviously Singh are really struggling to be able to find their feet in this conversation. I mean, Poilievre has the unfortunate part of having, Daniel Smith on one side, and obviously Doug Ford on the other side. It doesn't give him a lot of room to maneuver, even though they're worlds apart in their approaches. And Jagmeet Singh, I think, is really struggling to figure out how do you profile, the impact on people without actually having a solution that seems to work on the world stage. So politically, my sense is that this is still playing into Mark Carney's favor, and that he's doing a pretty good job, actually, of meeting what people are expecting out of it.
Yeah, I do want to go through the individual parties throughout the course of our time together, which will be extended today. But Shachi, how are voters responding to all of this is a perfect segue to you, because I'm looking at new data from a little-known institute called the Angus Reid Institute, which, like all the other pollsters, shows a seismic shift in polls. There's also a leaked internal poll we'll talk about a little bit later today. But where do you think voters are on this in terms of what they're looking for right now to respond to all the chaos in this moment?
Well, it really depends on how voters view the top issue, the ballot issue for themselves. And of course, the leaders are always going to try to frame the ballot issue. Donald Trump is like the looming villain in this narrative who keeps inserting himself into the campaign and tweaking or changing the ballot issue. But there is still a very core group of voters in this country for whom the Trump threats, particularly around annexation and a lot of the rhetoric, continues to take a backseat to cost of living issues. Cost of living and inflation is still the #1 issue identified across the board by 51% of Canadians. If there is a glimmer of anything right now for Pierre Poilievre, it is the fact that he tends to do better on that issue than he has done on responding to the Trump issue. I said in January it would take a catastrophic act of self-destruction on part of the Conservatives to blow the lead that they had. The thing I didn't anticipate was that the act would actually be a failure to act. And what we're seeing right now in terms of where voters are at and that surge to the Liberals is predicated, #1, on some Conservative voters changing their minds about Pierre Poilievre. It's totally to do with the Trump factor. It's also to do with Carney himself and people looking at Carney and saying, that's interesting. And then on the left side of the vote ledger, it's left of center voters saying, look, the Liberals seem to be a better choice than the NDP in terms of creating an anyone but conservative situation and blocking Poilievre. So Poilievre is really having to fight at this moment on a number of different fronts. It's less that he gives a fig about what Danielle Smith thinks. It's more to do with what her voters think. He cannot, I think he's been reticent to his detriment and strategically erred in trying to worry about and tick off right of center Trump admiring voters. I think there was a reticence to really go at Trump and risk annoying those voters. But at the same time, we're starting to see Poilievre get the assignment, understand the memo on the issue of taking the fight to Trump and making the case around that. In the meantime, if you're somebody who's more worried about Trump and all of that rhetoric, you're more likely to say, I'm breaking for the Liberals or for the left of center in this campaign. And that's the dichotomy that we're seeing set up.
Well, for reaction on what the impact of these tariffs could be, I want to talk to the mayor of Windsor, Ontario, the city that is synonymous with Canada's auto industry. Drew Dilkens is, of course, the mayor of that city. He joins me from Washington, D.C., where he's attending a trade summit with mayors from the U.S. and Mexico. Mayor Dilkens, I wonder what you're talking about at this summit. I wonder what your thoughts are on this latest move from Donald Trump, what it means for your city and your people.
Well, David, it's just more uncertainty. And I think people in my community for the last couple months have been very concerned, very afraid for what it means for their jobs in the community. And yesterday's announcement really just adds more uncertainty to that equation, trying to figure out what parts are made where, recognizing that 30 to 40,000 components go into a vehicle before it rolls off the finish line, and you have to try and decode all of the different assembly components along the way. Like this is a huge task, but people are concerned. There's no doubt about it.
This proposal from the Americans to sort of do a vivisection of a car to figure out which part is from where and tariff based on these component parts sounds enormously laborious, even if it does lead to a lower tariff rate. Just the cost of administering that might be incentive enough for people to go to the U.S. Is that your concern right now?
I think that it's very difficult to unscramble the egg. And so this industry, and those of us who live in Windsor, understand the tight integration of the automotive industry and the parts sector and tool, die, and mold. And so the thought that the president, by doing this, is going to somehow upend the entire auto industry and that everyone's just going to repatriate all businesses to the United States, or even a significant portion of them, I think it's just part of the fallacy. I mean, the U.S., first of all, part of the fallacy is that there's hundreds of billions of dollars of capital just sidelined waiting to be deployed to invest in the United States. We know that's not the case. When you look at the United States, they have about 4% unemployment. If you ask any economist, they will tell you that that is basically full employment in an economy. And so even if the capital was available to be deployed, they don't have the human capital to make this work in the short or medium term. And so there are a number of issues that the president has with executing his plan. But while he goes through sort of analyzing this, he's causing a lot of uncertainty and disruption that is impacting a really important industry that has been built up over the course of decades to the benefit of Canada and the United States. Like, we have built this industry together. And so it's really hard to understand why he's trying to dismantle it, how he's going to dismantle it. But while he's sort of going through the machinations of discovering what this industry is all about, he's causing a lot of uncertainty, which is the underlying issue.
Yeah, and I guess there's the question of term limits and how much, if you're going to do this kind of a disruption or rebuilding, it's a decade-long project. It would seem like not a 3.5-year sort of thing, to get that kind of capital deployed and all of these plants built, and a lot of economic pain along the way. So this is all happening, of course, in the middle of our election. You've seen Jagmeet Singh saying he wants to build cars entirely within Canada. Mark Carney has proposed increasing the amount of auto parts that are made in Canada, so there's less vulnerability to tariffs at the border. But it's a repatriation agenda sort of in response to the repatriation agenda. What are your thoughts on how that could affect things?
Well, listen, it sounds good to a domestic audience, but that's precisely what we're criticizing Donald Trump for doing, is thinking he's going to repatriate an industry that we built together. And so now we're proposing to do the reverse of that for Canadians. Of course, Canadians are going to say, fantastic, let's bring all these jobs back to Canada and build up our local industry. The thought of doing this is just impractical. It's not the most efficient business way to do it. What we really need to do is sit down with the president and his team and figure out what the pathway is going to look like on a wholesale basis, not just the auto industry or dairy, but put all of the issues on the table, sit down and figure out what our trading relationship is going to be like with our largest trading partner for the next 3 years and 9 months.
Right. So Mark Carney has proposed an all-in-Canada auto network, as many of the parts as possible. And you say this is basically not a practical thing to do. I wonder what the conversation is with your counterparts from the U.S. and Mexico at this conference you're at in Washington.
Yeah, so we're actually getting together tonight and for a big part of the day tomorrow. And we're aligned in the messaging that none of this makes any sense. People who are around the U.S. table. There are Republicans who are here who say, I voted for Donald Trump, but I didn't vote for this. This wasn't part of the agenda, and certainly attacking Canada in this way economically and even threatening to make Canada the 51st state is not what I signed up for when I elected Donald Trump. There has to be a better way, and we're talking about mayors who represent communities like mine, who have workers and families whose jobs are on the line. We've always said, it's not cliche to say that a tariff on Canada is a tax to American consumers, and they will pay the price as well. This trade war will have casualties on all sides. And so how do we get through this and set a pathway in motion that allows us to all to succeed, to continue to build our economies moving forward in a productive way, as opposed to this distraction that's in front of us right now?
Yeah. Look, it's a distraction, it's a threat, whatever you want to call it. It's not something Canada wanted, right? The country was standing around minding its own business, and here we are. You know, there is an impulse in the broader public, and certainly in an election, to hit back, and to hit back hard in a moment like this. We know Mark Carney and President Trump will speak in the next day or so. I mean, what do you think is the right move in terms of calibrating an actual response, and what message do you hope the Prime Minister delivers to the President?
Listen, I think we have to hit back if forced to do so. We didn't ask for this. We've been a good partner here, as you mentioned, all along the way. And where there are points of friction in our trading relationship, we have established trade agreements with dispute resolution mechanisms that allowed us to sort out the details of the differences that we have. And so if forced to hit back, we should hit back. I support that, and I'm sure most of my community would want to see that happen as well. But we hope it doesn't have to get there. And based on what we see yesterday, the president we're looking at next week for April the 2nd. The president has advanced a date early in May. There are a number of off-ramps here that if the right people can get around the table and have sensible conversations, that we can sort of put this off and have a wholesale renegotiation of our trading relationship.
Drew Dilkens, Mayor of Windsor, Ontario, thank you for joining us, sir. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, David.
Okay, the power panel is back. They were listening in on that conversation. Cameron Ahmad, James Moore, Andrew Thompson, and Shachi Kurl. Andrew, there's something about Mayor Dilkens. I like his look. I like his haircut. I like his glasses. I'm going to say that every time. But what did you make of his take?
Frames.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's very stylish. But Andrew, what did you make of his reaction to this whole idea of let's repatriate, fully, as Jagmeet Singh says, sort of the car industry, more of the car parts industry from Mark Carney, but it's sort of like fighting protectionism with protectionism on the most integrated industry on the continent.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is what the problem is that it's very hard, as others have said, to unscramble the egg once it's out, and that's what's being suggested here. Now, there is an emotional response. We want to be able to say, look, we're in control of our own destiny. What was it the Prime Minister said today? Something or other about us having agency, whatever that means. There is a sense that we want a degree of control, and that's causing a lot of leaders to lash out. But it is very much, as the mayor suggested, we've got to get back to kind of the smart set of solutions here, which is let's understand how we resolve the trade, the broader trade agenda that's out there. Trump understands that auto is probably the one area that he can exert the most pain on us. It's also seemed to be stuck in his head that they're going to go back to making K cars or something from the 1980s down in the Chrysler plants. He doesn't seem to have a very contemporary understanding of how the industries work. So he's, in this. I think the question is, how do we move the Americans, and how do we make sure we tailor our response in a way that actually meets what we need to do as Canadians? And we've talked about this before. This is one of the reasons we probably don't want to put an export tariff on oil. One of the reasons we don't want to put an export tariff to up the 10% on potash. We want to continue to have those parts of the economy that are function. Mm-hmm. What I thought was interesting today was Mark Carney's comments, and this is a little bit, I think, of where Singh will ultimately end up, is talking about the other industries that we need to bring up. We have gotten complacent in being able to rely on this very comfortable trade agreement. So what does that next set of industries look like? And Carney's starting to talk about that in terms of advanced manufacturing, in terms of AI, in terms of some of these other new sectors where we are seeing tremendous growth in Canada. We've just got to change our view of where the country's opportunity is and who we need to partner to drive it there. And I think that's what you're seeing the mayor talk about, supporting those that are already built in. That's what you're hearing Singh talk about. Let's support that. But it's also a question of how do we pivot to whatever's next. And Canadians are pretty good at that.
Well, Shachi, on that, how do you pivot to what's next when nobody seems to know what's coming? I know what's next in the industry sense, but the getting back to renegotiating the trade relationship, as Mayor Dilkens was talking about, Doug Ford scrummed today and said he spoke to Howard Lutnick and said to Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary of the United States what's happening on April 2nd? He said, I don't know. Like, nobody seems to know except Donald Trump and whoever puts the executive order in front of him to sign.
Well, and sometimes it's the last person who's talked to Donald Trump. It's the last person who's whispered in his ear. And we know this from the first season of this terrible, terrible TV show. So, it's, I don't mean to sound flippant. It's people's real lives. It's manufacturing jobs on both sides of the border. It's communities that are going to be hurt on both sides of the border. So, the frustration here is that we had this conversation as Canadians 8 years ago. There was a whole thing about diversifying trade and finding new global customers, and what has come of that? An almost irreparable relationship between Canada and China, what feels at the moment like an irreparable relationship between Canada and India. Now there's talk about, well, let's go back to Europe. We have a trade deal with Europe. How much has Canada leveraged that? How much have Canadian businesses and manufacturers leveraged that? And how much has government worked with industry to leverage that? There is so much runway for us to be creative as a country in this moment. Our productivity has been no bueno for a while. Like, this is a time for incredible innovation. This is a time to make a call out to the smartest people in the United States and say, there is innovation, research, R&D, and investment funds available to you. Come up to Canada and help build the next chapter of our economy and do it quickly. But you know what? Doing it quickly is going to be really, really hard. We have so many fires to fight on so many fronts, which makes the words good, but it makes the practicalities of actually doing any of this really, really difficult, complicated, slow, clunky. And in the meantime, Canadians are having to, you talked about the Liberals charting the flight path while they're in the air in terms of their campaign. Voters are having to do this too. They're being pulled from one end to another in terms of how do they make a choice, what's important. I just want to come back to Southwest Ontario for a minute. I pulled some numbers looking at that. And we see where Jagmeet Singh is. He's campaigning there. There's a reason he's campaigning there. In December, the Conservatives in that region were at 50%. The Liberals and the NDP were split at 20% each. Today, the Conservatives are at 45%, the Liberals are at 46%, and the NDP is at 6%.
Yeah, the electorate is polarizing in a massive way in this election. There's no question. Certainly in English Canada, the Bloc is obviously a big factor in Quebec. We are seeing U of T just hired a bunch of Yale professors who are leaving Donald Trump's America, so that might be part of the recruitment you're talking about there, Shachi. But Cameron, on this, a conversation about responding to this with industrial policy that the mayor of Windsor, Ontario doesn't come on and say, this is impractical. You can't do this. This is what the Americans are doing. I mean, what needs to happen in this bigger conversation on what to do to protect the auto sector without sort of trying to out-Trump Trump, because that's not a fight you can win.
All of the things that were discussed just before me, a rethinking of our economy and our big industries and our trading markets. I mean, there are many other markets outside of China and India, which of course we have to engage with and are already huge trading partners for us, but there's Southeast Asia, there's South America. Of course, there are European countries too, for whom Trump 2.0 is also a wake-up call and has caused an enormous rethink of their entire foreign policy, trading policy, and defense policy. But I think the most effective thing for this particular problem that we have right now is going to be our messaging to the American people and to American industries. And like those billboards that the government has put up across the United States.
Yeah, tariffs are a tax on your groceries.
Tariffs are a tax, exactly. On your cars, on your groceries, on your gas bill, on pretty much everything that you need. And as many Americans are also struggling with the cost of living crisis. And that's probably the only thing that will be effective in persuading the administration, or at least people around the president, to revisit these tariffs. Let's also remember that this is just the beginning and the very beginning of the administration, and there is so much more that we can expect. So we do have to brace for greater impact to our industries and and Canadian jobs. It's obviously going to be very painful, and I think a lot of people are getting that. But there's a ton of work that the entire country has to do to think differently and completely reshape how we how we imagine ourselves vis-a-vis the United States. We are, of course, the most affected because we're the closest and we're their biggest trading partner. But it's the same for every other country in the world that has relied on the United States for the better part of the last century.
So James, on that point, I mean, there was an impetus to rethink the trade relationship after sort of Trump won. Things like COVID and everything happened, which just kind of derailed a lot of the best intentions for people. China, obviously problematic. India, in the current context, very problematic with the allegations against the Modi government. How do you deal with this? It seems like there's a greater interest in internal trade barriers than we've seen, like with real movement this time, it seems. But, on protecting the auto sector, when everyone in the sector says we need to protect the continental sector, how do you approach it from a policy perspective?
Mayor Dilkens is an impressive leader and a really important voice. And I think he had some really important insights there in the interview that you just had with him. With regard to the United States, Jagmeet Singh continues to be, laughable in terms of his understanding of a sector that is so important to Ontario and important to him politically. We says, buy a car that's built from, headlight to turn light to
tailpipe to headlight to tailpipe,
whatever. That doesn't exist. So he's asking Canadians to do something that doesn't exist. And I think to Andrew's point, we shouldn't aspire to be that because it's not the direction that we want to go. Canada is the 5th largest auto consuming market in the entire planet. Canadians like their cars, and we live in inclement weather, and you have to have a vehicle in the snow to get your kids to and from school and to get your groceries and all that. So Canadians consume a lot of automobiles. We do have some say in this. We do have some influence in this. And Canadians will also be discerning customers when it comes to buying cars that have been excluded from the American marketplace in terms of the auto parts supply chain. We actually have real consumer power here in the auto sector, and we will exercise that effectively when we're informed about which automakers decide to exclude Canada. Second point that he made is that he said he talked to congressmen and women and governors in the United States about their sort of disillusionment with the Trump administration and all of this stuff. Because, to quote Logan Roy, money wins. And money understands that what Donald Trump is proposing here is extraordinarily stupid to the American economy and to the American automotive sector. And another thing that happened today that I think should not go without being mentioned and noticed within this context of trade is that Donald Trump pulled Elise Stefanik back from being appointed to the United Nations as ambassador to that body. Why? Because Donald Trump is down to a couple of votes in the U.S. Congress, and he needs her seat in upstate New York not to flip from red to blue, which it probably would do in a special election in that state. Donald Trump's margin in the U.S. Congress is extraordinarily wafer thin, which means that all of the stuff that Mayor Dilkens is doing, that Premier Ford is doing, that Premier Houston is doing, that our consuls general, 14 of them, I believe 17 of them in the United States are doing in their key sectors and markets in the United States. All of these levers of influence and power on key sectors like the automotive sector, which are entirely integrated to the benefit of the United States, to the benefit of Canada, need to be exploited, and their stories need to be told so that people understand on both sides of the borders that the automotive sector benefits dramatically by the strength of the North American integrated platform.
Well, go ahead, Andrew.
I just want to pick up on that point because I think this is really important what James is saying about this is going to ultimately be decided by how Americans respond to it. And you saw today one of the Republican congressmen out in Nebraska named Don Bacon or something.
Bacon, we've had him on the show. Yeah, he's one of the few people willing to defy Trump publicly and openly.
Absolutely. And in fact, going a step further today and saying that Congress needs to pull that power back from the American president to be able to declare these tariffs. So that is something that the Congress should be deciding. So, I mean, there's a lot of congressmen, there's a lot of senators I know in the Midwest who are concerned about, food and fertilizer prices and what that's going to do to their manufacturing sector. Those are the voices we need to continue to work for. So while we're thumping our chests and becoming all puffed up about what we can do on this side of the border, part of it is doing exactly what the mayor suggested. We need to keep reaching out to that side of the border because they're the ones who are ultimately going to get Trump to change his mind.
No, that's a
strategy that has been successful in the past. It's by leveraging all of our networks and reaching out to as many Americans as possible to have them join our chorus.